Gabrielle Weiniger. This is the Debka Files, bringing you exclusive news and insight from the Middle East and around the world. Coming up on this week's show, North Korea undertakes its sixth and most powerful nuclear test that leads to tremors in Seoul, and China and a spike in concerns among the international community. Debka Files asks how the isolated regime can be reined in. A Debka Files exclusive on the double game of Lebanese Shiite militia Hezbollah and Yemen's bloody civil war. And we discuss the future of Jordanian-Israeli relations after King Abdullah reportedly halts his once frequent contact with Israel's Prime Minister. Now to our top story, and North Korea's claim of a successful hydrogen bomb test may mark a major step in the isolated regime's long-stated goal to develop a nuclear-tipped intercontinental missile. Since Sunday, September 3rd, when North Korea conducted its sixth and most powerful nuclear test yet, we've heard words of condemnation from world powers and threats of heavier sanctions. Japan promising to do its utmost in cooperation with the United States to defend itself.
昨日、トランプ大統領およびプーチン大統領、そして先ほどムン・ジェイン大統領と電話首脳会談を行い、国際社会で緊密に連携していくことで完全に一致をいたしました。
Analysts at Debka File say the only response against this advance is unity, and governments may be considering reconciling with the idea of living with a nuclear-armed North Korea. As with Iran, 6 world powers negotiated the 2015 nuclear accord. If a similar lineup will confront Kim Jong-un, a collective 7-day ultimatum to dismantle their programs or else face their destruction, the regime may be brought to the negotiating table. But our experts say the North Korean leader will want much more than the deal struck with Tehran, as their arsenal is much more advanced. And Kim will look to be faithful to the legacy of his father, who declared in 1995 that a nuclear program is the only guarantee of his nation's survival. South Korea, for one, predicts more nuclear tests in the weeks to come.
미국에 대해 핵 투발 수단 확보를 과시하는 차원에서 ICBM급 탄도미사일을 발사할 가능성도 있는 것으로 전망됩니다. 또한 미측과 협조해서 항모강습단, 전략 폭격기 등 전략 자산 전개를 추진하겠습니다.
Well, to discuss all this, let's bring in this week's guest, Dr. Martin Sherman, founder and director of the Israel Institute for Strategic Studies. Dr. Sherman, thanks for being with us.
Thank you for inviting me.
Tensions have been escalating over the past month. We've seen new UN sanctions, more missile tests, threats of nuclear attacks between the US and North Korea, and now international calls for de-escalation. What can we expect to see happen next?
Well, I think the situation is extremely complicated and very explosive. And again, I think it illustrates the futility of trying to reach consensual agreements with tyrannical regimes. I remind the viewers that it wasn't long ago that Jimmy Carter was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for his efforts, among other things, to convince the North Koreans to move away from their weaponized military program. And we've seen how splendidly that worked out. So I think what we're seeing now, we're reaping the decades of lack of resolve of the Western powers to coerce North Korea to give up their program, and we may reap very bitter fruits from this, because it's not easy to see how this can be resolved without some sort of action beyond words and condemnation. I don't think that the North Koreans will be impressed by words, not even by sanctions. They've withstood years of sanctions. And unless they're faced with a credible, coercive military response, I don't see them backing away.
Are you advocating then for a military response? Do you think it's impossible to get Kim Jong-un to the negotiating table? And if the world powers are able to do that, what might we see him ask for in exchange for curbing his nuclear ambitions?
Well, I'm sure he'd certainly ask for recognition of continued nuclear capabilities. But, you know, I don't think it really matters much whether you bring him to the table, because if you bring him to the table and he signs an agreement, what is going to prevent him in the future from abrogating that agreement? Because he's seen that basically threats against him haven't worked. And so I think we've reached a very difficult situation. And I'm not sure what it means. I mean, you would never have believed a decade or two ago that the world would have been talking about living with a nuclear North Korea.
But we're living with a nuclear Iran. Can the same not be applied then to North Korea? And what can we learn from the Iranian nuclear deal?
Well, that's a very good question. We're not quite living with a nuclear Iran at the moment, but we may well do because of the very unfortunate agreement that was signed with the Obama regime. And we can see how Iran has been empowered across the globe, whether it's in Yemen or in Syria or any other places. I think the attempt to reach a consensual agreement with tyrannical regimes has failed, as it failed before in the 1930s.
Okay, Dr. Sherman, we'll leave it there for now, but do stay with us as we move to Syria, where some 300 ISIS fighters and their families have been left stranded on 17 buses and ambulances in the scorching heat of the Syrian desert this weekend. The Hezbollah brokered truce saw ISIS fighters leave the battlefield and head to their stronghold on the Iraqi border to the east. But the U.S. coalition has stopped that convoy, preventing it from moving by threatening to bombard them from the air, leading Hezbollah to accuse the U.S. of putting women and children in danger. On Thursday, Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah said he travelled to Damascus to meet with the Syrian president, Bashar al-Assad, to request the evacuation of these ISIS fighters from eastern Syria, to discover the fate of Lebanese soldiers captured by the jihadists, and that Bashar al-Assad was embarrassed by the deal but ultimately agreed. Take a listen to Nasrallah addressing the deal before we break it down from there.
أنا رحت عند رئيس بشار الأسد. أنا رحت على الشام لعنده. قلت له يا سيادة الرئيس، نحن شو في مصادر هيك بهالتفصيل، في مصادر عند الأمن العام جبناهم فتشوا ما لقينا شيء. مصادر مخابرات الجيش فتشوا ما لقينا شيء. عند حزب الله في مصادر فتشوا ما لقينا شيء. في ناس استسلموا لنا جبناهم فتشوا ما لقينا شيء. إذا انتهت هذه المعركة ولم يحسم مصير الجنود اللبنانيين في مشكل إنساني وسياسي كبير بالبلد. عاد الأمريكيون من جديد وطلبوا من المسؤولين اللبنانيين عدم القيام بهذه العملية العسكرية وضغطوا عليهم وهددوا بقطع المساعدات عن الجيش اللبناني إذا أقدمت الدولة اللبنانية على تنفيذ هذه العملية العسكرية.
Let's turn back to our guest, Dr. Sherman. A unique admission there from Nasrallah, publicly discussing going to Damascus despite criticism of this deal. But threats of US airstrikes have so far stopped its completion. Can we expect the US to stop arms supplies to the Lebanese army if it goes ahead with the assault?
Well, it's very difficult to decipher the logical code that drives US policy these days. So I wouldn't like to speculate because, that would have knock-on effects with the Iranian regime, who are allegedly blocking the ISIS fighters. So it would be very difficult to speculate. But I think the interesting point here is that it shows how nebulous the Shia-Sunni divide is, because what you've got here is actually an agreement between the Shia and Sunnis to allow something which very few people would have expected in the near past. So I think this is a warning light for people in Israel who suggest that we may be able to rely on a Sunni coalition, because we've seen that the Shiites and Sunnis can do deals, as we saw in Gaza, when Iran has now renewed its auspices over Hamas. So I think this shows us that it would be a very dicey bet to believe that the Shia-Sunni schism would hold for a long period of time, and Israel should not base any strategic decisions on that.
I just want to take you back, though, to what's happening right now. That convoy is still, as we speak, stuck there in the desert. Do you think it's going to cause a major dust-up between the US and Lebanon, and Hezbollah in particular? The US is pinning the convoy down and not letting the Syrians attack it or even reach the border. It's quite a dramatic standoff, isn't it?
Well, it certainly is, and it's very difficult to imagine a outcome that won't be sort of diffused by some sort of humanitarian gesture, maybe with the Americans taking these fighters into captivity. But this is a tough conundrum.
All right, we'll leave that there for now. Let's stay with Hezbollah, though, and Debka Files can exclusively reveal that its intelligence officers, that is Hezbollah intelligence officers, embedded in the various factions of the Yemen Houthi rebel movement, which controls the capital of Sana'a, have persuaded their leaders to arrest the former president Saleh. According to Debka's military and intelligence sources, Hezbollah showed the Houthis evidence that Saleh has been secretly consorting with the Saudis to switch sides. That is, from the fragile alliance with Houthi leaders to the side of the Saudi-led coalition in the country's devastating civil war. However, at the same time, Hezbollah agents have also offered to broker a deal with Houthi leaders to promote rebel unity. That's an apparent double game that we will delve into with our guest very shortly. But first, this latest statement from former President Saleh after a rally of thousands of his supporters in Sana'a this week.
نرفدها مش بالآلاف ولا بالمئات بعشرات الآلاف من المقاتلين عشرات الآلاف من المقاتلين الموجودين في مساكنهم والذي شغلتهم هيكلة الفرهادي الذي هيكل الجيش والأمن فهم في مساكنهم وعلى استعداد للانطلاق إلى جبهات القتال وما على حكومة الإنقاذ إلا توفير العتاد فقط. نحن مدججين بالسلاح، سلاحنا وعتادنا موجود، عليكم أن توفروا العتاد والمرتبات فقط.
To unravel the latest goings-on, let's turn back to our guest, Dr. Martin Sherman of the Israel Institute for Strategic Studies. Dr. Sherman, without the Saleh faction, will the Iran-backed Houthis cave in this civil war?
Well, you know, I think now, given the empowerment of Iraq, but the deal with Obama, they've certainly got much more staying power. And I think what we're seeing now is the gradual encirclement of the region by a Shiite crescent, which again, as I think, would never have happened without the Obama deal with Iran and the huge amounts of money that were transferred to the regime.
Debka's sources are saying this is a rift between Houthis and Saleh, and they're saying it was a Hezbollah maneuver. That means they're playing both sides. What's the motive behind the group's actions in Yemen and this apparent double game?
Well, one of the reports I saw suggested that this is a ruse to try and trap the Saudis into action under the impression that there is a rift when there isn't really a rift, and to draw them into a battle which they may well lose and force the Saudis to withdraw.
There is currently actually a Saudi offensive that began last week on the Red Sea port town of Hudaydah. That may be a key test for the Houthis. That port's under their control and also the main entry point for the majority of Yemen's food supplies and also their humanitarian aid. This battleground could be seen as a key test for the unity of the rebels and for the outcome of the war in general, couldn't it? Yes,
I think it could. But again, you know, it shows, you know, I'm a bit parochial, so I'm always trying to work out what the implications for Israel are. And there's quite a strong lobby in Israel supporting Israel adopting the Arab Peace Initiative. And I think this disarray and these shifting alliances within the Arab world should really be a warning for Israel as to the consequences of adopting the Arab Peace Initiative based on a prevailing configuration of so-called alliances. So I think that's one of the reasons, one of the things that Israel should take note of.
Before we go into that, let's move on now. And Turkish President Tayyip Erdogan has called out a decision by an American court to arrest Turkish security guards involved in a fight back in May during his visit to the American capital. Erdogan blaming the Kyrgyzstan Workers' Party, or the PKK, and accusing the U.S. of failing to provide him protection during his visit.
Bununla ilgili söylenecek tek şey, zaten Dışişleri Bakanımız biliyorsunuz, Amerika Büyükelçisini Dışişleri Bakanlığı'na çağırdılar. Gerekli uyarıları kendilerine yaptılar. Bu başlı başına bir skandaldır. Yani Amerika'da adaletin nasıl çalıştığının çok açık, net bir skandal ifadesidir.
Well, this comes just days after US-led coalition forces fired back after being shot at near Manbij. That's in northern Syria last week. That area said to be held by Turkish-backed rebels. No casualties in that exchange, but a day later, the coalition told Turkey to tell the rebels it backs there that firing on their forces is, quote, not acceptable. All this just after American defense officials held meetings in Ankara to assure its ally over its clashing military partnership with a collection of local Syrian forces, forces who Turkey considers to be terrorists, allied with the PKK. Let's go into this a bit further with our guest, Dr. Martin Sherman. Tensions between these NATO allies have increased dramatically since the attempted coup in Turkey on July 15th last year. Are these incidents, both the exchange of fire and the arrest of Turkish guards on American soil, a sign of further escalation between the two allies?
Well, I think in general the relationships between Turkey and the West can only go south. I think, again, trying to draw the implications for Israel. I was always.
Before we get to that, though, where do you think the red line is? Where do you think, how far can these allies push each other?
Well, that's a good question, and I'm not sure that I could define an easily visible line. But I think it's going to be a gradual across the board deterioration, and this is going to create a very serious problem for NATO, because what are you going to do with a recalcitrant member like Turkey, who now is also drawing closer and closer to Iran over the Kurdish issue? So this is really a tangled mess. I really don't think that I'm in a position to say, well, if Turkey does this, the US will do that.
All right, let's pick up on that Kurdish issue then. There's an upcoming independence referendum in the semi-autonomous regional council of Iraq. How does that play into that? I mean, Washington's also opposed to the vote. How will they play a stronger hand with their Kurdish allies to keep Turkey on side? Will they have to do that?
Again, I think the American attitude to Kurdish independence here highlights the double standard of international relations. Because if you look at the Kurdish claim for independence, which the Americans oppose, and the Palestinian claim for independence, which the Americans support, it's night and day. I think a far stronger case could be made for Kurdish independence and the strategic importance of Turkey for the West, rather than for the Palestinians. So I think that this is an interesting issue that deserves much more attention. Why the Americans have this paradoxical, almost perverse dichotomy in the relations vis-a-vis the Turkish independence, the Kurdish independence, and the Palestinian claims for independence.
Well, talking of claims for independence, more deteriorating relations, and to Israel and Jordan, they're left reeling from July's crisis on Jerusalem's Flashpoint Temple Mount compound and the subsequent spillover to Amman, which saw an Israeli security officer shoot dead 2 Jordanians, one said to be armed with a screwdriver, during the altercation at the Israeli embassy in the Jordanian capital. Jordan's King Abdullah, after appeals by the US, Saudi Arabia and Egypt, did agree to calm the turmoil and evacuate the Israeli embassy, so long as the Israeli officer be put on trial in Israel with a harsh prison sentence. Subsequent popular discontent in Jordan has meant that the Israeli ambassador and the staff at the embassy in Amman still have yet to be allowed to return. Now, Debka File sources say relations are going into deep freeze. Abdullah reportedly having lost faith in Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, halting his once frequent phone conversations over security and intelligence cooperation, and protesting the visit by 2 Israeli lawmakers to the Temple Mount. That was the first of its kind in 8 months. Let's turn to our guest for the final time tonight, founder and director of the Israel Institute for Strategic Studies, Dr. Martin Sherman. Let's look first at our region here at home. How might this worsening fracture in Jordanian-Israeli relations affect the peace process with the Palestinians?
Well, I've always been a proponent of treating the Jordanian-Israeli relationship as one with a short shelf life. And I think the working assumption must be that the Jordanian regime has a limit to its longevity. And, I would find it very curious, given the depth of the dependency of Jordan on Israel, that they would cut off their relationship over something like the incident in the embassy. Because after all, what you had you had an Israeli diplomat being attacked and defending himself, which is hardly a reason or justification for the kind of response that we're seeing with the Jordanians now. So I think that Israel should treat its relations with Jordan with great skepticism and plan for the institution of an alternative regime, whether with the king as a figurehead or whether with someone else in his place.
I want to turn what you said on its head, though. Can Israel really afford to risk losing one of its only regional allies?
Well, it depends what the price is. I'm not quite sure whether the loss of Jordan is something that Israel can control, but much like the Turkey incident we talked about before. Turkey used to be one of Israel's closest allies. Today it's certainly one of its most threatening adversaries, and that got nothing to do with Israel. I do not believe that Israel can do anything to improve relations with Turkey, and I think the kind of pressures on the Hashemite regime may produce the same situation. In order to survive, King Hussein may have to adopt a position which doesn't matter what Israel does. In Turkey, for instance, I don't think the relationships depend on what Israel does or doesn't do, but on what Turkey has become and what Israel is. And I think we could find a deteriorating situation in Jordan which would reflect similar realities.
We'll keep an eye on those relations with Jordan. We'll have to leave it there for now. Dr. Martin Sherman, founder and director of the Israel Institute for Strategic Studies, thank you for your take on these issues as we move along.
Thank you.
Now let's bring you this week's News in Brief. The Iraqi army, the Kurdish Peshmerga and pro-Iranian Iraqi Shiite PMU are joining forces for the second time. After capturing Tal Afar last week, they're set to launch an offensive on the ISIS-held Hawija pocket. That's 55 kilometers southwest of Kirkuk's key oil fields. Video shows the Iraqi Air Force dropping leaflets on residents, advising them to avoid ISIS positions ahead of the offensive. Syria, Iraq and Iran have begun pumping heavy military strength into the strategic Al-Tanf crossing. That's on the border near the main highway connecting Baghdad, Damascus and Amman. Right there, a key base for U.S. Special Forces training and equipping Syrian rebels since March of this year. And Scotland Yard has reopened a 3-decades-old inquiry into the assassination of famed Palestinian refugee and cartoonist Naji al-Ali, without explaining why. The main suspect at the time was Yasser Arafat. Most of al-Ali's cartoons criticised the PLO and Fatah, but the case of his gunning down on the streets of London was never solved. The Met says a lot can change in 30 years, and many who were not willing to speak out at the time of the murder may now come forward. We'll keep you updated on that inquiry into the murder of Naji al-Ali as more details emerge, as well as all the other stories you heard here. For all that and more, why not sign up for Debka's weekly newsletter? You can get delivered straight to your inbox, or visit our website at the bottom of your screen now. That's debka.com/weekly. Thanks for joining us here at Debka Files. See you again next week. Bye-bye.